Break the Job Matrix. Reclaim Your Life. Written and published by Rising Audiobook. Introduction. You didn't wake up one day and choose the life you're living. It was built quietly, layer by layer, long before you ever had the awareness to question it. A routine here, a rule there, a reward for obedience, a warning for curiosity. Over time, it stopped feeling like a system and started feeling like reality. From the first years of school, you were taught how to follow instructions, not how to design a life. You learned how to be correct, not how to be free, and slowly, without noticing, success was defined for you. Get good grades, get a job, stay safe, don't question too much. They called it stability. They called it job security. But what if that security is just dependency with a better name? A carefully maintained comfort that quietly trades your time, your energy, and your choices for predictability. The most powerful systems don't feel like cages. They feel like normal life. That's why so many people never realize they are inside one. Not because they are trapped by walls, but because they are guided by habits, expectations, and fears they mistake for their own decisions. But once you start seeing it, you can't fully unsee it. And that is where this story begins. Chapter 1. The Matrix. You didn't notice entering. Before you ever made a conscious decision about the kind of life you wanted, decisions were already being made around you, shaping what you would eventually believe is possible. Not through force, not through control, but through repetition, through approval, through quiet reinforcement that felt like normal life. As a child, you quickly learned what earned attention and praise. Sit still, follow instructions, give the expected answer. Don't ask too many questions that drift outside the lesson plan. Curiosity had limits, even if nobody explicitly said so. It was rewarded when it stayed inside the lines and corrected when it wandered too far. Over time, you didn't just learn subjects, you learned behavior. You learned how to be evaluated, how to be ranked, how to be good. And good rarely meant creative, independent, or uncertain. It meant compliant. This is where the first invisible layer of the matrix begins. Not as oppression, but as training. A slow conditioning of the mind to equate safety with obedience. Then came the formula, not written on any official document, but repeated in tone, in advice, in expectations from parents, teachers, and society at large. Good student, Rogig. University, good job, good life. It sounds harmless, logical, even responsible, but what it quietly does is replace exploration with direction. It narrows the infinite possibilities of a human life into a single corridor with socially approved exits. And because everyone around you seemed to accept it, you rarely questioned it. In fact, questioning it often felt like rebellion or confusion or lack of seriousness. The system doesn't need to forbid curiosity. It simply rewards conformity more consistently than exploration. And what gets rewarded repeatedly becomes what feels right. As you moved forward, uncertainty began to feel dangerous. Not because it was truly unsafe, but because it was unfamiliar. You were taught to avoid risks, to choose stability, to prioritize secure paths. Somewhere along the way, uncertainty stopped being seen as a natural part of growth and started being treated as failure waiting to happen. So people began to shrink their decisions, not suddenly, but gradually, choosing the safer degree, the safer job, the safer opinion, the safer version of themselves. A quiet trade happens here. Possibility is exchanged for predictability. And because everyone around you is making similar trades, it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like normal adulthood. But the most powerful systems in the world don't announce themselves. They don't need to. They operate through repetition until repetition becomes identity. Think about it. How many of your early life choices were truly designed by you, and how many were inherited from expectations you never examined? At what point did you stop asking, "What do I want to create with my life?" and start asking, "What is the safest option available?" The shift is so subtle that most people never notice it happening. They don't feel a turning point. They simply wake up one day living inside a direction they never consciously chose, but now feel responsible to maintain. This is the matrix. Not a place, not a system you can point to easily, but a pattern of thinking that becomes invisible because it is shared by almost everyone around you. Most people never question the script, because the script comes disguised as common sense. Go to school, get a job, pay bills, stay consistent, don't take unnecessary risks, be realistic. And realistic becomes a word that quietly limits imagination, because imagination threatens systems built on predictability. The truth is, the matrix doesn't force you to stay inside it. It simply makes everything outside of it feel uncertain, impractical, or irresponsible. And for a young mind trying to belonging often feels more important than exploring what else might be possible. So the path continues, step by step, year by year, until one day you look around and realize your life is functioning exactly as expected, but you never actually remember choosing it. And that realization, subtle at first, is where everything begins to shift. Chapter 2. The paycheck loop that never ends. The moment money arrives on a schedule, life quietly changes its shape. Not loudly, not dramatically, but structurally. It is the difference between standing on shifting ground and standing on a platform that never moves. At first, that stability feels like victory. After all the uncertainty, the unpredictable income, the tension of not knowing what comes next, now there is rhythm. A fixed day, a fixed amount, a predictable confirmation that life is still functioning, and that predictability feels like safety. But what feels like safety is often the beginning of dependency. A monthly salary does not just provide income, it introduces a psychological loop, a repeating cycle that starts to organize how you think, plan, and decide. Life no longer feels like a continuous open field. It becomes segmented into intervals: waiting, receiving, spending, surviving, waiting again. And slowly, without asking permission, your mind begins to adapt to that rhythm. You stop thinking in years. You start thinking in months. You stop planning in direction. You start planning in cycles. What can I do before next salary? What is possible after bills? What is safe until the next deposit arrives? These questions feel practical, responsible, mature. But underneath them is a shift that most people never notice. Life is no longer being led by vision. It is being led by timing, and timing belongs to the system, not to you. At first, the paycheck loop feels like relief from chaos. And it is. Predictability reduces anxiety. It removes the immediate fear of survival. It gives structure where uncertainty once existed. But structure has a hidden cost when it becomes total. It starts to define boundaries that feel natural, even when they are not chosen. You begin to unconsciously organize your entire life around the continuity of income, not because you are forced to, but because you are stabilized by it. And anything that stabilizes you long enough eventually begins to shape your decisions. The most subtle shift happens in experimentation. When income is unpredictable, experimentation is often forced. It becomes survival-driven creativity. You try things because you must. But when income becomes stable, experimentation quietly reduces. Not because opportunities disappear, but because the risk of disrupting stability feels unnecessary. Why try something uncertain when something certain already exists? This question sounds reasonable, but it contains the hidden mechanism of limitation, because certain does not mean aligned. It only means repeated. Over time, decisions begin to orbit the paycheck without you realizing it. You delay opportunities that don't fit neatly around salary timing. You avoid risks that might interrupt income flow. You prioritize decisions that maintain consistency over those that might create expansion. And slowly, without noticing, your life begins to shrink inside the boundaries of financial predictability. This is not because the system demands it. It is because comfort quietly trains behavior. Expenses begin to follow the same pattern. At first, increases in spending feel like progress: a better phone, a slightly improved living space, more convenience, more comfort. Each adjustment feels earned, justified, logical. But what is rarely noticed is that expenses do not just increase, they adapt. They expand to meet income, not all at once, but gradually, subtly, almost politely. And once lifestyle adjusts upward, it becomes emotionally difficult to reverse it. Not because it is impossible, but because it feels like loss instead of adjustment. Even when the original increase was unnecessary for survival, it becomes part of perceived stability. Now the system is complete. Income defines lifestyle. Lifestyle defines obligation. Obligation defines dependency, and dependency defines fear of change. At this stage, freedom begins to shrink without being directly reduced. No one removes it. No one takes it away. It simply becomes less accessible because more of life is tied to maintaining the current structure. The paycheck does not just support life, it begins to organize it. And the organization becomes invisible because it is consistent. This is why many people remain in roles far longer than their emotional or intellectual alignment suggests. Not because they are unaware of dissatisfaction, but because dissatisfaction is not enough to override structural dependency. A person may dislike their job, they may feel disconnected from their direction, they may sense that their time could be used differently, but the paycheck arrives with precision, bills are covered, life continues, and continuity becomes more influential than alignment. This is how a decade can pass inside a structure that feels wrong, but functions correctly. 10 years in a job that does not inspire them, 10 years of predictable income, 10 years of life organized around stability rather than direction, and still, from the outside, everything appears fine because the loop does not require happiness to function. It only requires continuation. This is the hidden strength of the paycheck system. It does not force you to stay. It makes staying feel rational. It does not punish change. It increases perceived risk of change. And when the brain evaluates risk repeatedly, it begins to prefer known discomfort over unknown possibility. So people remain, not because they are unaware of alternatives, but because alternatives feel less stable than continuation. The loop becomes strongest when it is invisible. When income arrives on time every month, the mind stops questioning the structure behind it. It focuses on results, not systems, on survival, not design, on continuity, not direction. But once you begin to see the loop, something shifts internally. You notice that time is being segmented by external cycles. You notice that decisions are being filtered through income timing. You notice that experimentation has been quietly reduced. You notice that stability has become the dominant organizing principle of life. And in that noticing, the loop stops being absolute. It becomes visible. And what is visible can no longer fully control perception in the same way. Because awareness introduces distance, and distance introduces choice. Not immediate escape, not dramatic change, but recognition that what feels like natural structure is actually a repeated cycle of dependency, reinforced by predictability. The paycheck loop is not inherently harmful. It provides order. It reduces uncertainty. It creates stability in a chaotic world. But when stability becomes the only organizing principle, it begins to define the boundaries of possibility. And once possibility is constrained, even comfort can start to feel like limitation. That is the moment where the loop is no longer just experienced, it is understood. And understanding is where the next shift quietly begins. Chapter 3. Trading your life for security. There is a trade most people make so early in life that they never fully recognize it as a trade. It feels like responsibility. It feels like adulthood. It feels like the right thing to do. But underneath all of that language, something more permanent is being exchanged, something you can't earn back once it's spent: time. Not abstract time, Not philosophical time, your waking hours, your attention, your energy when it is still fresh, your ability to choose what you engage with while you are fully alive and fully aware, and in return you receive security, a steady income, a predictable structure, a sense that tomorrow will not collapse unexpectedly. At first, this feels like balance, a fair exchange. You give effort and you receive stability. The system presents itself as reasonable, even generous. But the hidden detail is this: time is not renewable, and security is not free. Every hour sold is an hour that does not return. Every week committed to routine becomes another segment of life, shaped by obligation rather than intention. And slowly, what begins as an exchange becomes a pattern that feels impossible to interrupt. Because security is powerful, not because it creates freedom, but because it reduces fear. And when fear is reduced, questioning becomes rare. Most people do not notice when the trade deepens. They only notice that life becomes more organized, more predictable, more structured. The calendar fills, the responsibilities stack, and everything feels under control. But control of what exactly? Life, or just the continuation of the system? There is a subtle shift that happens here. Work stops being something you do and becomes something you revolve around. Your energy is no longer directed by curiosity or desire. It is allocated according to obligation. You begin to arrange your life around availability, deadlines, and expectations that were never designed by you. And yet, because the structure is stable, it is interpreted as success. This is where survival begins to disguise itself as achievement. People say they are doing well because they are employed, because bills are paid, because responsibilities are handled. But very rarely do they ask a deeper question: at what cost is this stability maintained? Not financial cost, personal cost, because what is slowly being spent is not just time, it is vitality. The part of you that experiments, the part of you that wonders, the part of you that might have taken a different path if fear had not been so efficiently managed. Security often masks dissatisfaction because it removes urgency. When basic needs are met, discomfort becomes easier to tolerate. You can live inside misalignment for years without it forcing immediate change. There is no crisis, only continuity, and continuity is one of the strongest forces that keeps people from moving, so they stay, not because they are fulfilled, but because nothing is breaking loudly enough to demand action. The irony is that comfort today can quietly purchase limitation tomorrow, because while you are building stability, you are also building dependency on that stability. Your lifestyle adapts to your income. Your responsibilities expand with your capacity. Your identity becomes tied to your role in maintaining it all. And as that structure grows, leaving it begins to feel less like a choice and more like a risk to survival itself. This is how freedom gradually narrows, not through restriction, but through accumulation. More responsibility, more routine, more dependence on consistent output, more attachment to the system that provides predictability, and slowly the idea of stepping outside of it starts to feel unreasonable, even reckless. But here is the part most people avoid acknowledging. Survival is not the same thing as living. Survival ensures continuation. Living requires direction, and in the pursuit of security, direction is often the first thing to quietly disappear. There is a difference between being stable and being aligned. Stability means things do not fall apart. Alignment means things are moving towards something you actually chose. Many people confuse the absence of crisis with the presence of success. They believe that if nothing is wrong, then something must be right. But life is not measured only by what is avoided. It is also measured by what is created, and creation requires space, mental space, emotional space, time that is not pre-assigned before the day begins. When every hour is exchanged for obligation, there is very little left for creation, only recovery, only repetition, only preparation for the next cycle. Over time, even questioning this structure begins to feel dangerous, because questioning implies uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens the very security that has been carefully built. So the mind adapts. It quiets the questions. It normalizes the routine. It reframes exhaustion as dedication. It reframes limitation as responsibility. And life continues. But deep underneath that continuation, something remains unresolved. A quiet awareness that not all stability is freedom and not all security is safety. There is a moment, subtle, almost unnoticeable, when a person begins to realize that they are not just working to live. They are structuring their entire existence around the preservation of income rather than the expansion of life. And in that moment, the trade becomes visible. Time for security. Energy for predictability. Life for continuation. Once seen clearly, it cannot be unseen in the same way again. Chapter 4. The identity trap of being an employee. At some point, the role you perform stops being something you do and starts becoming something you are. It begins in a subtle way. You answer a simple question, "What do you do?" And instead of describing your interests, your curiosity, or what you are building in life, you default to a label, a job title, a category, a single word that summarizes years of effort, education, and routine. I am an engineer. I am an accountant. I am a teacher. I am an employee. It feels normal, socially efficient, easy to communicate. But hidden inside that simplicity is a quiet shift in identity. Because language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. And the more often you repeat a role as your identity, the more your mind begins to treat it as your definition. You stop thinking of yourself as a person who works, and slowly start seeing yourself as work itself. This is the identity trap. It doesn't happen suddenly. It develops through repetition, validation, and structure. In workplaces, you are rewarded for execution, not exploration. You are praised for completing tasks correctly, not for questioning whether the task itself could be done differently. Over time, this reinforcement teaches a quiet lesson. Your value lies in performance, not perspective. And when performance becomes the measure of value, identity begins to narrow. You start to separate your life into two categories, what is me and what is my job. But eventually, the line between the two fades, because so much of your waking life is spent inside the role that it becomes difficult to remember what exists outside of it. Even your language begins to shift. You don't say, "I am someone who works in accounting." You say, "I am an accountant." That small difference carries a deep psychological weight. One describes a role you occupy, the other defines what you are. And once identity fuses with occupation, change becomes threatening. Because if you are your job, then losing your job does not feel like losing income. It feels like losing yourself. In modern systems, creativity often gets filtered through structure. You are encouraged to think, but only within boundaries. You are encouraged to improve, but only within existing frameworks. Innovation is allowed, but only if it does not disrupt the underlying system. So slowly, people stop creating and start executing. Execution is predictable, it is measurable. It fits into performance reviews, KPIs, and quarterly reports. Creativity, on the other hand, is uncertain. It requires space, failure, and exploration, things that structured environments often unconsciously discourage. And when creativity is repeatedly constrained, something important happens inside the mind. It begins to prefer safety over originality. It begins to value approval over expression. It begins to trade possibility for predictability. This is how employees are formed, not just through hiring, but through conditioning. Over time, self-worth becomes tied to external evaluation. Performance reviews are no longer just feedback. They become reflections of personal value. A good review feels like validation of identity. A poor review feels like a personal flaw. The role and the person are no longer separate in the emotional experience. This is where the trap deepens. Because when identity depends on evaluation, and evaluation depends on external systems, self-worth becomes unstable. It rises and falls based on metrics that are not fully under your control, and yet, emotionally, they begin to define how you see yourself. You start to internalize outcomes as identity. If you succeed, you are valuable. If you fail, you are inadequate. If you are promoted, you are growing. If you are stagnant, you are stuck. But life is far more complex than performance metrics can capture. There is a difference between what you do and who you are. But in structured environments, that difference slowly erodes. You might notice it in small moments. The discomfort when you are not productive, the guilt when you rest without justification, the subtle anxiety when your output feels lower than expected. These are not just workplace effects, they are identity effects. Because when work becomes identity, rest feels like loss of self. And yet perhaps the most dangerous part of this trap is how normal it feels. Everyone around you is doing the same thing. Everyone is identifying with their roles. Everyone is answering life's questions through job titles. So it doesn't feel like a loss, it feels like participation in reality. Until something disrupts it. Consider a man who has worked for years as an accountant. For a long time his identity is clear. He introduces himself that way. He is respected for it. He builds routines, relationships, and expectations around it. His sense of self becomes stable because his role is stable. Then, unexpectedly, the job disappears. Not just the income, but the structure, the routine, the validation. And in that moment, something unexpected happens. He does not simply feel unemployed. He feels undefined, as if the label that once gave him clarity was also the container of his identity. Without it, he struggles to answer a question that once felt simple: who am I now? This is not just a financial crisis, it is an identity rupture. Because when a role becomes identity, its removal feels like erasure. And yet what remains underneath is often something deeper that was never fully developed. The person beyond the title, the thinker, the creator, the observer, the one who existed before the role became dominant. But reconnecting with that part requires a shift in perception. It requires separating value from performance. It requires recognizing that roles are temporary structures, not permanent definitions. It requires seeing work as something you engage in, not something you become. Most people never make this separation consciously. They move through life accumulating roles, titles, and responsibilities until identity becomes a collection of external labels rather than internal understanding. And because those labels are socially reinforced, they feel real, they feel solid, they feel like truth. But identity built entirely on external roles is fragile. It depends on continuation. It depends on recognition. It depends on systems outside of yourself remaining stable. The moment any of those change, the identity wavers. And that is why this trap is so powerful. It feels like stability until it is tested. But once you begin to see the difference between what you do and who you are, something begins to loosen. Not immediately, not dramatically, but quietly. The role stops feeling like a cage and starts becoming something you can step in and out of. And in that space, a new possibility appears. The possibility of being more than a title. Chapter 5. The Silent Burnout Society. Somewhere along the way, exhaustion stopped asking permission. It simply walked into daily life, sat down beside ambition, and started being mistaken for proof that life is working correctly. You can hear it in ordinary conversations, not as complaint, but as identity. I'm always busy. I barely have time to rest. I haven't stopped all week. And instead of alarm, these sentences often receive a quiet nod of respect, as if being drained is evidence of importance, as if fatigue is a receipt for effort. This is how the silent burnout society is built, not through collapse, but through normalization. Being tired becomes a signal that you are doing enough. And when tiredness becomes a signal of success, recovery starts to feel suspicious. Rest no longer feels like something necessary for survival. It begins to feel like something that must be justified. You don't simply rest, you negotiate rest. You earn it, you postpone it, you schedule it around everything else that is considered real work. And slowly, without noticing, rest becomes guilt wearing a softer name. This is where the internal distortion begins. Because the body still understands its need for recovery, but the mind starts to argue against it. The body says stop, the mind says later. The body slows down, the mind speeds up. And in that conflict, people learn to override themselves repeatedly, not once, not twice, but daily. Over time, overworking becomes more than a habit. It becomes a form of social validation, a quiet competition that no one explicitly announces, but everyone participates in. Who is the busiest? Who is the most overloaded? Who is sacrificing the most sleep, time, and energy? And strangely, these conditions begin to sound like achievements rather than warnings. But burnout does not appear as collapse at first. It appears as adaptation. You still function. You still complete tasks. You still respond to messages. You still meet expectations. But something internal begins to flatten. Joy takes longer to arrive. Focus becomes harder to sustain. Even simple decisions require more effort than they should. Yet because performance continues, the system assumes everything is fine. That assumption is the danger. Mental fatigue is not loud in the beginning. It is quiet. It builds in the background while output continues in the foreground. It does not interrupt productivity immediately. It erodes the capacity to enjoy it. And because society measures success through output, not internal condition, the warning signs are often invisible until they are not. There is a moment where exhaustion stops being something you feel and starts becoming something you carry, not temporary tiredness, but a baseline state, a constant background weight that no longer fully disappears after sleep or rest. At that point, recovery is no longer about a break. It becomes about repair. But most people do not reach that understanding early. They continue pushing because stopping feels like falling behind. And falling behind feels like failure. So the cycle continues. Effort increases, rest decreases, pressure becomes normal, and fatigue becomes identity. I'm just someone who works hard. I don't really get time to relax. This is just how life is right now. These statements sound like acceptance, but they are often resignation disguised as realism, because the system rewards continuation, not reflection. And when continuation is rewarded more than awareness, people learn to ignore themselves in order to keep up with external expectations. Even the idea of rest begins to shift. Rest stops being neutral. It becomes something to be earned after exhaustion has already peaked. Not prevention, but compensation. Not maintenance, but recovery from overload. And by the time rest arrives, it is no longer restorative. It is necessary repair after prolonged depletion. But the deeper issue is not just physical tiredness, it is cognitive overload that becomes normalized. A mind constantly processing tasks, responsibilities, expectations, comparisons, deadlines. A mental environment that rarely quiets long enough to reset. And in that environment, clarity becomes rare, not because it is impossible, but because it is never protected. Eventually something gives, not always dramatically, sometimes quietly. Motivation drops, concentration weakens, emotional distance increases, the sense of meaning becomes harder to access. But because life still continues externally, internally deterioration is often ignored, until it accumulates enough to become unavoidable. And then people describe it as sudden. I don't know what happened, I just burned out. But burnout rarely begins suddenly. It builds in silence, while productivity continues to look intact from the outside. This is why it is called a silent society, not because no one experiences it, but because everyone adapts to it. And adaptation is mistaken for strength. But there is a difference between functioning and thriving, between continuing and living, between pushing forward and actually being present in the life you are building. Burnout is what happens when that difference is ignored for too long. And once you begin to see it clearly, something subtle shifts. You stop measuring your value by how tired you are, and start noticing that exhaustion was never meant to be the proof of a life well lived. Chapter 6. School, Degrees and the Employment Illusion. Before most people ever enter the workforce, they are already being shaped for it. Not in an obvious way, not through explicit instruction that says you will become an employee, but through structure, repetition, and a very specific definition of what success looks like. Long before a person applies for a job, they are taught how to sit inside systems, follow instructions, and produce expected outcomes under evaluation. School is often seen as preparation for life, but it is more accurately preparation for a particular type of life, one built around roles, schedules, and external assessment. From an early stage, learning is measured not by curiosity, but by recall. The ability to repeat information accurately is rewarded more consistently than the ability to question it. Memorization becomes the pathway to approval, and approval becomes the pathway to advancement. This creates a subtle but powerful message. Understanding is less important than compliance with expectations. Over time, students learn to optimize for outcomes rather than exploration. The goal becomes not what can I discover, but what will get me the grade. This shift seems small in the moment, but it reshapes how thinking itself develops. Curiosity, which is naturally open-ended, becomes narrowed into structured performance. And structured performance is exactly what most job systems later require. Career paths begin to take shape long before real choice is involved. Certain subjects are labeled practical, certain ambitions are labeled realistic, certain dreams are quietly discouraged because they do not fit within established pathways. Even guidance is often directional rather than exploratory. Become this, study that, choose something safe. Safety becomes the invisible curriculum. By the time degrees enter the picture, the system has already defined what those degrees represent. They are not just evidence of learning, they are signals of conformity to a process, a proof that you can complete tasks over time, follow instructions, meet deadlines, and operate within structured expectations. In that sense, degrees often function less as measures of capability and more as indicators of participation in a system. This does not mean education has no value. It means its value is often interpreted through a narrow lens. The system tends to reward those who can perform within its boundaries, not necessarily those who question the boundaries themselves. And questioning, in many environments, is subtly discouraged. Not always directly suppressed, but often deprioritized. The student who asks why beyond the curriculum is sometimes seen as disruptive rather than insightful. The focus remains on completing what is required, not expanding beyond it. Over time, this shapes a mindset where compliance feels safer than exploration. So people learn early how to succeed inside systems, but not necessarily how to design systems of their own. This is where the employment illusion begins to form. The belief is simple. Education leads to degrees, degrees lead to jobs, and jobs lead to stability. On the surface, this appears logical. It creates structure in a world that often feels uncertain. But what is rarely discussed is how tightly this structure defines the boundaries of possibility. Because once education is aligned primarily with employment, learning becomes preparation for roles rather than creation of opportunities. Students are trained to fit into existing systems, not to imagine alternatives outside them. And when most of education is oriented toward employment, it becomes natural to assume that employment is the only meaningful outcome of education. This assumption becomes deeply embedded. It is rarely questioned because it is widely shared. And when a belief is universally reinforced, it starts to feel like fact rather than design. But underneath this structure is a quiet limitation. It channels talent into predefined categories before individuals have fully explored what they might actually want to build. This is why many people enter adulthood with qualifications, but without clarity. They have learned how to succeed in exams, how to complete degrees, how to follow structured paths, but not necessarily how to navigate uncertainty or create independent direction. The system is efficient at producing workers, less consistent at producing creators. And yet, most people do not notice this until much later, when they realize that the path they followed was not fully chosen, it was gradually guided. Even then, questioning the system feels uncomfortable, because the system is not just external, it is internalized. It becomes part of identity, expectation, and social validation. To question it feels like questioning one's own decisions, one's own education, one's own past effort. So instead of questioning, many people rationalize. They assume this is just how life works. They adapt rather than reflect. But adaptation without awareness can lead to quiet limitation. The employment illusion is not that jobs are meaningless or education is useless. It is that the pathway between them is often presented as the only pathway, when in reality it is only one structure among many possible ways of building a life. Once that becomes visible, something important shifts. Education is no longer seen only as preparation for employment. It becomes a tool, one that can either reinforce existing systems or be used to understand and potentially move beyond them. And in that shift, the illusion begins to loosen, because what was once seen as a single unavoidable path starts to reveal itself as one of many possible directions. Chapter 7. The fear that keeps you locked in. Fear does not usually announce itself as fear. It arrives disguised as logic. It speaks in calm sentences, reasonable explanations, responsible decisions. It sounds like not now, not yet, be practical, wait until things are stable. And because it speaks the language of caution, it often goes unquestioned. But underneath that calm voice is a mechanism that quietly shapes entire life trajectories without needing permission. Fear of failure is the first and most visible layer. It doesn't stop ambition. It redirects it into delay. A person may have ideas, skills, even clear opportunities, but the moment action becomes real, instead of imagined, the mind begins constructing outcomes that have not happened yet. Mistakes are anticipated before attempts are made. Rejection is felt before exposure. Loss is experienced before risk is even taken. So experimentation is replaced with preparation. And preparation, when it never transitions into action, becomes a holding pattern disguised as progress. Plans feel productive. Research feels responsible. Thinking feels safe. But nothing moves beyond the boundary of thought into reality. And slowly, life becomes something rehearsed instead of lived. The mind learns to equate hesitation with wisdom. The longer something is delayed, the more justified the delay begins to feel. And what could have been a short moment of discomfort becomes an extended identity of not ready yet. But readiness is rarely a state that arrives fully formed. It is usually built through engagement, not avoidance. Then fear shifts shape into something more social, fear of judgment. This form does not require anyone to actually speak. It survives entirely in anticipation. Before a decision is made, an invisible audience appears in the mind. Family reactions, friends' opinions, colleagues' interpretations, society's expectations, and suddenly, choices are no longer evaluated based on personal direction, but based on projected perception. What will they think if this fails? What will they say if I change direction? How will I be seen if this doesn't work out? These questions feel like awareness, but they are often restriction in disguise, because imagined judgment carries emotional weight even without evidence. The mind reacts to potential perception as if it is already real, and in doing so, it begins to prioritize approval over exploration. This is how life slowly becomes optimized for acceptance instead of alignment, and alignment is what gets lost in the process. The third layer is the most subtle fear of uncertainty. Unlike failure or judgment, uncertainty does not present a specific threat. It is not tied to a clear outcome. It is simply the absence of guaranteed direction. And for a mind conditioned by structured systems, school, work, schedules, predictable income. Absence of structure feels like instability, so the unknown becomes something to avoid rather than something to explore. Even when current reality feels limiting, familiar limitation still feels safer than unfamiliar possibility. This is why people often remain in situations that no longer inspire them, not because they believe it is ideal, but because it is predictable. The known discomfort feels more manageable than the unknown alternative. Stability begins to outweigh possibility, and when stability becomes the dominant value, life starts to narrow around what can be maintained rather than what can be expanded. But stability, when unchallenged, can slowly turn into containment. Fear uses these three layers together to create a loop that feels rational from the inside. Fear of failure says, "Don't try yet." Fear of judgment says, "Don't be seen trying." Fear of uncertainty says, "Don't leave what is known." And when combined, they form a complete system of internal restriction that requires no external enforcement. Action becomes delayed. Risk becomes minimized. Possibility becomes postponed. And life continues inside a controlled boundary that feels safe enough to avoid discomfort, but small enough to limit expansion. A skilled designer understands this loop very well in practice. They have ability, they have ideas, they have awareness of better possibilities. They may even feel that their current job does not fully reflect their potential or direction. Freelancing appears as a logical next step, but the moment it shifts from concept to action, fear intervenes. What if I fail? That single question begins to expand internally, not because failure is guaranteed, but because the mind treats possibility as prediction. It starts constructing scenarios where income becomes unstable, where clients do not arrive, where reputation is uncertain, where effort does not immediately translate into reward. Meanwhile, the current job, though limiting, though misaligned, offers something more immediate: predictability. Even if it barely covers their dreams, it covers their survival. And survival, in moments of uncertainty, often outweighs direction, so the decision is postponed. Not because freelancing is impossible, but because failure feels more visible than potential, and this is how entire paths remain unexplored, not through rejection from the outside, but through hesitation on the inside. Fear does not stop movement by force. It stops movement by offering an alternative that feels safer in the moment. Stay where you are, avoid risk, maintain stability, delay uncertainty, and because these options reduce immediate discomfort, they are chosen repeatedly. But repetition creates pattern, and pattern creates identity. Over time, a person does not just avoid risk. They begin to see themselves as someone who is not a risk-taker, someone who is not ready, someone who prefers stability, someone who doesn't do that kind of thing. But these identities are often not inherent truths. They are accumulated responses to repeated hesitation. And once identity forms around avoidance, fear no longer needs to actively intervene. It becomes self-sustaining. The loop continues without resistance. But awareness begins to interrupt that loop, because once fear is observed instead of obeyed, it loses some of its authority. You begin to notice that fear rarely predicts outcomes, it predicts discomfort, and discomfort is not the same as danger. You begin to see that most limitations are not external barriers, but internal negotiations that repeat until they feel permanent. And in that recognition, something shifts quietly. Fear is no longer invisible. It becomes a mechanism you can observe. And what can be observed is no longer absolute. It becomes something you can respond to, rather than something that decides for you. That is the first point where the chain starts to loosen, not by eliminating fear, but by no longer treating it as the final authority over action. Chapter 8. The moment you start questioning everything. There is a point in many lives that does not arrive with celebration or warning. It doesn't announce itself as transformation. It doesn't feel like progress at first. In fact, it often feels like discomfort, a quiet internal disruption that begins to blur the clarity of a life that once felt structured and understandable. Everything still works. The job continues. The routine continues. The responsibilities are still met. From the outside, nothing appears to be changing, but inside, something has already started to shift. It begins with a subtle sense that the environment you are operating in no longer matches the scale of what you feel capable of becoming. Tasks that once felt meaningful begin to feel repetitive. Goals that once felt motivating begin to feel procedural. Even achievements that used to bring satisfaction start to fade faster than expected. It is not that success disappears, it is that its emotional impact weakens. This is often the first sign that awareness is beginning to expand beyond routine identity. At first, most people try to correct this feeling by doing more, working harder, becoming more efficient, setting new targets, increasing productivity. The assumption is that dissatisfaction comes from insufficient performance, so effort is increased to restore meaning. But meaning does not return through repetition, because the discomfort is not caused by lack of effort. It is caused by misalignment. There comes a stage where routine success no longer feels like progression. It feels like maintenance. You are moving, but not necessarily evolving. You are completing cycles, but not necessarily expanding direction. And in that space, a quiet question begins to form. Is this it? Not in a dramatic or emotional sense, but in a calm, almost analytical way, a moment where the structure of life is observed, rather than simply participated in. And once observation begins, participation becomes less automatic. This is where awareness enters the system. Awareness is not rebellion, it is recognition. It is the ability to see patterns that were previously invisible because you were fully embedded inside them. And when patterns become visible, they stop feeling absolute. One of the first things people notice during this stage is how narrow their current structure feels compared to the range of possibilities they can now imagine. Alternatives that were once dismissed begin to feel intellectually valid. Paths that were once considered unrealistic begin to feel at least worth exploring mentally. It is not that the external world has changed, it is that perception has widened. And with that widening, comparison begins to happen. Not comparison with others, but comparison between current reality and potential reality, between what is and what could be. This comparison creates tension, not destructive tension, but revealing tension, because it exposes the gap between participation and potential, and that gap is difficult to ignore once it is seen clearly. Routine success, which once provided reassurance, starts to feel insufficient as a measure of life direction. You begin to realize that being effective inside a system is not the same as building something that belongs to you. You can be highly functional, highly productive, even highly respected, and still feel internally disconnected from the life being constructed around you. This realization does not come as a breakdown. It comes as clarity. And clarity often begins as discomfort, because when awareness expands faster than structure changes, imbalance appears. You continue doing what you have always done, but you can no longer fully believe that it represents your entire possibility. This is the moment where many people quietly start observing their life, instead of fully identifying with it. They notice patterns they once ignored. They see how time is allocated. They feel how energy is distributed. They become aware of how much of their day is reactive rather than intentional. And slowly the question shifts from, how do I perform better here, to why am I here in this exact form of structure? This shift is subtle, but irreversible. Consider a top-performing employee. Someone who has consistently delivered results, met expectations, and followed the structure with discipline. For years, their identity is stable. They are reliable, capable, productive. But then something changes internally. They begin to realize how quickly time has passed without a corresponding sense of personal development outside the system. They look at their days and see repetition rather than expansion. Meetings, tasks, deadlines, achievements, but very little that feels self-directed. And then the realization appears quietly, without drama. I've been busy for 5 years, but I'm not actually building my life. That sentence does not come from failure. It comes from awareness of direction, and direction is different from activity. Activity can be measured. Direction must be felt. This moment is not a crisis. It is an awakening of perception. But awakenings are rarely comfortable because they reveal that what once felt complete may actually be incomplete. Not wrong, not wasted, just limited in scope. And once limitation is seen, it cannot be unseen in the same way again. What follows is often a phase of internal negotiation, a mental comparison between stability and possibility, between what is secure and what is unknown, between what is socially validated and what is personally meaningful. The system you are in does not immediately lose its structure, but its emotional authority begins to weaken. It stops feeling like the only valid framework for life. It becomes one framework among others, and that alone changes everything. Because once alternatives are visible, choice re-enters the picture. Not immediate action, not sudden transformation, but choice. And choice is what was quietly removed long before awareness appeared. This is why the moment of questioning is so significant. It is not the decision to leave or change anything yet. It is the moment you realize that your current structure is not the only structure available. That realization alone begins to reshape internal boundaries. You no longer move through life purely on habit. You begin to move with observation. You begin to notice rather than simply execute. And in that noticing, something dormant starts to return. The sense that your life is not just something you maintain, but something you can actively design. The system does not collapse at this stage. It simply stops being unquestioned. And once something is no longer unquestioned, it is no longer absolute. It becomes a choice. And that is where real change quietly begins. Chapter 9. Rewriting your internal operating system. Something shifts the moment you realize that most of your decisions are not actually decisions. They are responses. Responses to income pressure. Responses to expectations. Responses to fear of instability. Responses to habits built long before you ever questioned them. And once you see that clearly, a deeper question begins to form underneath everything else. If so much of life has been automatic, what part of it has actually been designed by you? This is where the idea of an internal operating system becomes real, not as a metaphor, but as a structure, a hidden framework that processes beliefs about money, work, identity, time and possibility, a system that runs quietly in the background, shaping choices before you consciously explain them. Most people are running survival-based programming without realizing it. Survival programming is not failure. It is inherited logic. 5. It is built from environments where safety mattered more than expansion, where stability was rewarded more than experimentation, and where predictability was considered smarter than exploration. So the mind learns a simple equation. Stay within structure, avoid unnecessary risk, exchange time for security, and prioritize consistency over creation. At first, this system works. It keeps life stable enough to function. It reduces uncertainty. It creates a sense of order in a world that often feels unpredictable. But over time, the same system begins to feel limiting. Not because life becomes harder, but because awareness becomes sharper. You start noticing that your relationship with money is not just financial, it is psychological. Money is not only something you earn, it becomes something you react to. It influences timing, decisions, and even identity. You begin to feel that income is not just support for life, but a constraint around it. And when that realization deepens, beliefs about work begin to shift as well. Work stops being viewed only as obligation. It starts revealing itself as structure, a system designed to convert time into output within defined boundaries. And within that structure, your role has been defined more by participation than by design. This is where identity begins to loosen. The identity of worker is not wrong, it is just incomplete when it becomes the only lens through which you see yourself. Because a worker operates inside systems, but a creator begins to question them, and that distinction changes everything. A worker asks, "What do I need to do today?" A creator asks, "What am I building that continues beyond today?" A worker focuses on tasks. A creator focuses on outcomes. A worker optimizes effort. A creator optimizes structure. And once your thinking begins to shift toward creation, the way you see time begins to transform. Time is no longer just something consumed by responsibilities. It becomes something allocated toward outcomes. It is no longer purely sacrifice. It becomes investment. Every hour is no longer just spent. It is placed somewhere with intention. Even ordinary work begins to look different under this lens. Instead of seeing tasks as isolated obligations, you start seeing them as inputs into larger systems. You begin to notice patterns, repetitions, inefficiencies, opportunities for structuring work differently. This is where the shift from jobs to systems begins. Jobs are linear. They depend on presence, repetition, and time exchange. Systems are structural. They produce outcomes through design, not just effort. Jobs ask you to perform, systems ask you to build. And when you start thinking in systems, your entire perception of control changes. You stop asking, "How can I work more efficiently within this role?" and start asking, "What structure produces results without requiring constant input?" This question alone begins to rewire how you interpret opportunity. Because now, income is not just tied to hours, it becomes tied to design. Value becomes something that can be multiplied, not just repeated, and work becomes something that can scale beyond immediate effort. But this shift does not happen instantly. It begins internally, long before it becomes visible externally. It starts with noticing how often your choices are shaped by survival thinking, the urge to choose stability over possibility, the reflex to avoid uncertainty even when it contains potential, the tendency to measure success by safety rather than direction. Survival thinking is not something you remove. It is something you upgrade. You do not discard the old system, you rewrite its rules. Instead of avoid risk, it becomes understand risk before avoiding or engaging. Instead of exchange time for security, it becomes use time to build leverage. Instead of work equals survival, it becomes work equals creation of value structures. This is the beginning of internal reprogramming, and like any system upgrade, it creates temporary discomfort. Old patterns do not disappear immediately. They resist change because they are familiar. They feel safer even when they are limiting. So there is a period where both systems overlap. One part of you still reacts from survival logic. Another part begins to think from creation logic, and the tension between the two is where transformation actually happens. You might still feel the pull towards stability, but now you also begin to see the cost of never moving beyond it. You might still hesitate before uncertainty, but now you also recognize that uncertainty is where all new structures begin. Gradually, identity starts to shift again, not from employee to escapee, but from employee to builder, from someone who only executes within systems to someone who also evaluates and designs them. This does not mean leaving everything behind. It means no longer letting existing systems define the full boundary of your thinking. Even within a job, you begin to think differently. You notice where value is created. You see how processes could be improved. You start observing patterns that were previously invisible because you were focused only on execution. And that observation is the beginning of ownership mindset. Because ownership does not start with assets, it starts with perception. Perception of structure, perception of value flow, perception of how time transforms into outcomes. Once that perception changes, your decisions naturally begin to shift with it. You become more intentional with time because you see it as input, not just duration. You become more aware of skills because you see them as tools for leverage, not just job requirements. You become more selective about effort because you understand that not all effort creates scalable value. And slowly, life stops feeling like something you are just moving through. It starts feeling like something you are structuring. This is the internal operating system rewrite. Not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet restructuring of how you interpret reality. And once that structure changes, everything built on top of it begins to change as well. Chapter 10. Learning how money actually works. Most people grow up believing they understand money simply because they use it every day. They earn it, they spend it, they save what is left, and in doing so, they assume they understand its deeper structure. But using money is not the same as understanding how money moves, grows, and concentrates. And this misunderstanding quietly shapes entire lives. Because when money is only seen as something received in exchange for time, life becomes organized around time limits rather than value expansion. Work becomes the primary source of income, hours become the measurement unit of worth, and salary becomes the ceiling of possibility. But money, in its deeper structure, is not limited to time exchange. Money is a representation of value transfer. And once you understand that, the entire framework begins to shift. Income is not just salary. Salary is one form of income. Structured, predictable, linear. But it is only one expression of how value can be exchanged in the world. There are other forms that do not depend strictly on hours worked or physical presence, because value itself can exist independently of time once it is properly structured. This is where most people remain stuck in the first layer of financial thinking. They learn how to work for money, but not how money can be made to work through systems. The difference is subtle in language, but massive in outcome. Working for money is linear. It requires continuous input for continuous output. Stop working, and income stops. But systems of value creation introduce non-linearity. Output becomes partially independent of immediate effort. This does not mean effort disappears. It means effort is structured differently, and structure changes everything. This is where skills become important, not just as tools for employment, but as assets that can scale beyond time. A skill tied only to a job remains confined within that job's structure, but a skill that can be applied across systems, communication, design, programming, marketing, writing, analysis, can begin to produce value in multiple directions. Because skills are not inherently linear, their application is. When you apply a skill in a fixed job, its output is capped by hours. When you apply the same skill in scalable environments, its output can multiply beyond direct time input. This is where the concept of leverage begins to emerge. Leverage is what separates effort from outcome. Without leverage, every result is proportional to time spent. With leverage, results can expand beyond time constraints. And there are different forms of leverage: tools, systems, distribution, technology, and increasingly digital platforms that allow a single input to reach many outputs. This is why the digital world has fundamentally changed the nature of income generation. It has introduced non-linear pathways where value can be created once and distributed repeatedly. A single piece of content, a single system, a single design, a single product can reach multiple people without requiring repeated effort for each interaction. This is not theory. It is structural reality. But it requires a different way of thinking. Because if you are trained only in linear income thinking, non-linear systems feel unfamiliar, even unstable, even risky, not because they are inherently unsafe, but because they do not fit the mental model built around time for money exchange. So most people continue optimizing within linear systems: more hours, more effort, more efficiency. But the ceiling remains the same. This is where ownership becomes the critical distinction. Ownership means control over the system that produces value, not just participation within it. When you do not own the system, your income depends on external structure. When you own even a small part of a system, your income begins to reflect how that system performs, not just how long you work within it. This is a fundamental shift in economic identity, from labor contributor to value architect, from time exchanger to system participant, from role executor to outcome designer. And this shift changes how you interpret opportunity itself, because once you see money as a function of systems rather than hours, your focus naturally moves toward building or contributing to systems that scale value, not because you reject work, but because you redefine what work is. Work stops being something you sell. It becomes something you design, and design requires thinking in structures. For example, instead of asking, "How can I earn more per hour?" the question becomes, "How can my output continue to generate value beyond the moment I create it?" Instead of asking, "What job pays the most?" the question becomes, "What systems reward value that grows over time?" Instead of asking, "How do I get hired?" the question becomes, "How do I position my skills so they produce independent value?" These are not just financial questions, they are structural questions, because money, at scale, follows structure, not effort alone. This is why two people with similar skills can have completely different outcomes. One applies skills within a closed system, the other applies skills within a scalable system. The difference is not talent, it is architecture. And once you see this clearly, money stops feeling like something you chase. It starts feeling like something that responds to structure. There is also a psychological shift that happens here. When income is tied only to labor, time becomes something to protect carefully, but also sacrifice constantly. It creates tension between living and earning. But when income begins to include systems, time begins to gain flexibility, because value is no longer strictly locked to your immediate presence. This does not mean work disappears. It means work evolves, from repetitive input to strategic design, from constant effort to leveraged creation. And this is where many people begin to realize that their previous understanding of money was not incorrect, but incomplete. They knew how to earn, but not how to structure earning. They knew how to work, but not how to multiply work. They knew how to survive financially, but not how to design financial flow. And that difference defines long-term direction more than any single decision. Even now, this understanding does not require immediate drastic change. It begins with perception, with noticing where value is being created, how it is being distributed, and whether it depends entirely on your continuous time or whether it can exist beyond it. Because once you start observing money this way, your questions begin to change naturally. And when your questions change, your direction changes. You stop asking how to exchange more time. You start asking how to create more value per unit of time, and eventually how to design systems where value continues even when time is not directly involved. That is the point where money stops being a limitation of life and starts becoming a reflection of how you structure it. Chapter 11. Reclaim your life. Redefine success. There comes a point in every long journey of awareness where understanding is no longer enough. You can see the patterns. You can recognize the structure. You can name the systems that shaped you. You can trace how decisions were influenced, how fear was reinforced, how identity was narrowed, and how time was quietly exchanged for stability. But seeing is not the same as living differently. At some stage, awareness demands translation into action, and this is where the final shift begins, not as rebellion, not as escape, but as redefinition. Because the deepest transformation is not leaving a system, it is no longer needing it to define your direction. For most of life, success is something received from outside. It is assigned through comparison, measurement, and social validation. Grades define it in school. Titles define it in careers. Income defines it in adulthood. Recognition defines it in social spaces. And because success is externally assigned, life begins to revolve around meeting external criteria. You start asking, am I doing enough? Am I ahead or behind? Am I stable enough, productive enough, acceptable enough? But underneath all of these questions is a deeper pattern. Success is being measured through someone else's framework. This is why even achievement can feel hollow. because achievement within a borrowed definition still belongs to someone else's design. Reclaiming your life begins when success stops being assigned and starts being defined internally, not emotionally, not impulsively, but structurally. You begin to decide what success actually means in the context of your own life, not the system you were placed inside. And once that shift happens, everything reorganizes. Because if success is no longer external, then life decisions no longer aim to satisfy external expectations. They begin to align with something deeper: freedom. Freedom is not a single event. It is not a destination you arrive at. It is a series of design choices that gradually reduce dependence on external permission. At first, this shift feels uncomfortable, because most decisions have been filtered through approval systems for so long that independent decision-making feels uncertain, even risky, even irrational. But something begins to change when you stop asking, "What is safe according to others?" and start asking, "What is mine to build?" This question is fundamentally different. What is safe keeps you inside existing structures. What is mine to build places you outside them, even if only mentally at first. And that mental shift is where real reorientation begins. Because when you think in terms of building, you stop seeing your life as a sequence of obligations and start seeing it as a collection of design opportunities. Your time becomes something to allocate intentionally. Your skills become something to develop strategically. Your income becomes something to structure, not just receive. Your daily actions become inputs into a system you are gradually shaping. And slowly, you begin to notice that freedom is not something granted by external systems. It is something constructed through internal decisions. At this stage, success begins to detach from comparison. You no longer measure your life primarily against others, because comparison requires shared criteria. And once you redefine success, those criteria no longer fully apply. Instead, you begin measuring alignment. Is my life aligned with how I want to spend my time? Is my work aligned with how I want to use my energy? Are my decisions aligned with the level of independence I want to build? Alignment replaces approval, and that replacement is not symbolic. It changes behavior. You stop optimizing for acceptance and start optimizing for direction. This is where many people begin to restructure their lives in subtle but meaningful ways, not necessarily through dramatic exits or sudden changes, but through incremental redesign, reducing unnecessary commitments, redirecting time towards skill development, building small systems that generate independent value, experimenting with ways of working that are not entirely dependent on fixed structures. A former employee, for example, might begin by building a small online income system, not immediately as a full replacement for their job, but as an additional structure that introduces flexibility. At first, it is just experimentation, a side effort, something built after hours. There is no pressure for it to become everything. But over time, something interesting happens. The system begins to produce value independently, not instantly, not massively, but consistently enough to change perception. It proves that income is not exclusively tied to full-time presence. It demonstrates that value can be structured outside traditional frameworks, and that realization changes everything. Because now time is no longer entirely locked. With even partial independence, decisions begin to shift. They choose to reduce working hours, not to escape responsibility, but to reclaim control over time allocation, not because work is rejected, but because work is no longer the only structure defining life. And that difference is essential. This is not about leaving work. It is about removing dependency. Work still exists. Effort still exists. Discipline still exists. But now they exist inside a life that is partially self-designed rather than fully externally assigned. This is the essence of redefining success. Success becomes the ability to direct your own time. Success becomes the ability to shape your own income structure. Success becomes the ability to make decisions without excessive dependence on external approval. Success becomes the ability to build systems that support your life rather than consume it. And once success is defined this way, the entire emotional relationship with life changes. You no longer feel like you are trying to keep up with a predefined standard. You feel like you are building a personal architecture. Some parts will be efficient, some parts will need adjustment, some parts will evolve over time, but all of it becomes yours. That ownership changes the psychological weight of daily life. Work stops feeling like obligation and starts feeling like design execution. Time stops feeling like pressure and starts feeling like resource. Effort stops feeling like depletion and starts feeling like investment. Even uncertainty changes meaning. Uncertainty is no longer treated as danger. It is treated as space for construction, because anything you are building that has not existed before will naturally begin in uncertainty. And when uncertainty is no longer feared, possibility expands. At this stage, the question, what is safe, loses its dominance. Safety is no longer ignored, but it is no longer the primary filter of decision-making. Instead, a different question becomes central. What kind of life am I actively building with the time I have? This question cannot be answered by systems designed for standardization. It requires personal definition, personal structure, personal responsibility. And that responsibility is what makes the shift irreversible. Because once you accept that your life is something you can design, you can no longer fully return to living it as something assigned. There will still be external systems. There will still be jobs, responsibilities, structures, and expectations. But their role changes. They become components, not definitions, and you become the designer, not the product. This is what it means to reclaim your life, not to remove structure entirely, not to reject work or responsibility, but to ensure that structure serves direction rather than replaces it. And in that state, freedom is not a distant concept. It is embedded in daily decisions. It is present in how time is allocated. It is present in how work is chosen. It is present in how income is structured. It is present in how identity is defined. Freedom becomes less about where you are and more about how your life is organized. And success, finally, becomes something no longer borrowed from society. It becomes something authored by you, a life no longer lived to match a system, but a life built, step by step, according to your own design. There is a moment after awareness where something quietly changes, and it does not go back. Once you see the patterns that shaped your choices, the systems that guided your thinking, and the invisible structures that defined what you called normal life, comfort is never quite the same again. It still exists, it still functions, but it no longer feels unquestioned. You cannot fully unsee what you now understand, and that is the point of no return. Because awareness is not an event, it is a permanent shift in perception. You may return to old routines, old environments, and old responsibilities, but you return differently. What once felt automatic now feels observed. What once felt fixed now feels constructed. What once felt like just life now feels like a system you are moving through, not simply living inside. Freedom, then, is not something granted in a single moment. It is not a final destination where everything becomes easy or perfectly clear. It is a sequence of daily decisions, small, repeated acts of choosing direction over default, intention over habit, design over drift. And many will hear this and still step back into the familiar. Not because they did not understand, but because understanding alone does not override comfort. The old path remains powerful precisely because it is known, repeated, and socially reinforced. But the real question was never whether escape is possible. The real question is whether you will act differently now that you see, because the matrix is not a place you are locked inside. It is a pattern you participate in, often without noticing, often without questioning, often without choosing otherwise. And once participation becomes visible, it becomes optional. What remains after this is simple, but not easy: to continue as before, or to begin again with awareness. And that choice, repeated daily, is where your life is truly reclaimed.